The hospital room smelled of harsh, stinging chemicals and stale air, a sharp contrast to the flowers Brielle had brought earlier. I stared at the plastic tube taped to my nose, feeling the faint, rhythmic cool of oxygen hitting my nostrils. It was the only thing tethering me to steady breathing. "Stop faking it. You just want attention," Brielle said. Her voice dropped to that whisper she used when she wanted witnesses. Even though we were the only two people in the room, I didn't answer. I couldn't afford to waste the breath, and besides, I'd learned the hard way that anything I said would be twisted later. My phone lay face down on the bedside table, the recorder still active. I'd switched it on the moment her shadow crossed the threshold, having finally stopped pretending that our family dynamic was anything other than a slow-motion car crash. Brielle stood at the end of the bed, her face a mask of practiced concern that didn't reach her eyes. She glanced at the water carafe where she'd propped up her phone, the camera lens pointed directly at me. I realized then she wasn't just here to play the part of the devoted sister. She was here to build her content. She wanted to capture me at my most vulnerable. "The doctor said you're stable, Elena," she continued, her tone sharpening. "But you're still refusing to sign the release forms? Do you have any idea how much this is hurting, Mom?" "I'm not signing anything until I see the accounting," I managed to choke out. My voice sounded thin, raspy, not like my own. "The hospital still hasn't received the funds you claimed were paid." "You are making this so difficult," Brielle snapped. She moved toward the bed, the sweet veneer finally cracking. "You've always been like this. Stronger, smarter, so you think you can just control everyone." She reached out, her fingers quick and practiced. She grabbed the plastic tube. I tried to reach up, to swat her hand away, but my muscles felt like lead. My reaction was too slow. With a sharp tug, she ripped the tube from my nose and flung it onto the floor, well out of my reach. The pulse oximeter immediately let out a frantic, shrill alarm. As the oxygen saturation number dropped and the waveform broke into erratic peaks, I gasped, the air in the room suddenly feeling heavy, suffocating. "You're doing this to yourself," Brielle said, her voice eerily calm as she adjusted her phone. She didn't call for the nurse. She didn't press the call button. She just watched, waiting for the panic she knew would come. I clawed at the bedsheet, my lungs burning, everything starting to dim at the edges. Just as the darkness began to pull me under, the door flew open. Dana, the night nurse, stormed in, her face pale with alarm. She shoved Brielle aside, grabbed the discarded tube, and shoved it back into place. Everything became a blur of activity. Cold hands, stern voices, the rush of oxygen returning to my throat. I drifted in and out, exhausted, every nerve ending screaming from the effort of trying to stay conscious. When I finally woke up, the morning light was filtering through the blinds. 2 police officers were standing on the far side of the bed, their faces unreadable. Beside them, Tessa stood like a sentinel, her jaw tight. Through the open doorway, Brielle waited beside hospital security, her shoulders shaking with loud, wet sobs. "Your sister gave security a video that begins 43 seconds after the recording started," Detective Price said, his voice clipped and professional. "We have preserved her phone and requested the original file." The brass key to the condo felt heavy, cool, and impossibly permanent in my palm. It was the only thing I owned that did not carry a debt or a hidden expectation. 6 months before the hospital room became my cage, I had stood in this empty living room, the echo of my own footsteps sounding strange against the hardwood floors. Tessa stood behind me, clutching 2 mugs of lukewarm coffee from the corner store. She didn't say anything, which was why she had been my only friend for nearly 2 decades. I carried a single cardboard box inside. It held the basics: a stapler, a stack of blank manila folders, and a coffee maker that belonged to me, not the house on Oak Street. That was where my mother still lived, surrounded by the ghosts of a marriage that had ended 18 years ago. My father's death in 2007 had turned that house into a shrine, and somehow, I had become the perpetual guardian of the artifacts. I had deferred my college dreams by a semester to pay for the funeral, and then I had worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on, while Brielle, only 14 at the time, drifted through her teens like a guest in our lives. "You really didn't tell your mom?" Tessa asked, her voice quiet in the hollow space. I shook my head, setting the box on the counter. If I told her, the entire family would be here by tomorrow. They would want to christen the place with opinions on where the sofa should go and why I was moving so far from their reach. 3 miles. That was the distance between my new life and the suffocating gravity of my mother's home. It felt like 300. I opened the folder, the crisp edges of the paper grounding me. Inside were the bank statements I had spent months quietly organizing. For years, I had played the role of the silent underwriter. Tuition for Brielle, the emergency mortgage payment when the plumbing failed, the unexpected dental bills for Patricia. Each receipt represented a piece of my own future that I had surrendered in the name of family unity. I had been strong, and because I was strong, I was expected to carry everything. That evening, I started the transfer. A recurring deposit, small at first, moved into an account tucked away at a bank no one in the family ever used. It was not much, but it was mine. I updated my cloud storage settings, systematically stripping Brielle of access to the shared files and email accounts we had operated for years. Every click felt like pulling a splinter out of my own skin. 2 months later, in November, the breath started to leave me. It wasn't a sudden departure, but a slow, creeping exhaustion that made every stairwell feel like a climb up a mountain. My doctor called it pulmonary inflammation. He spoke of rest and inhalers, his words clicking into place like the final piece of a puzzle I had been too busy to solve. I told Tessa, and I told the office, but I said nothing to Patricia or Brielle. When Patricia finally pried the truth out of me over a Sunday dinner, her face had settled into that familiar, disappointed cast. "You always focus on the negative, Elena," she said, cutting her chicken with precision. "Brielle is worried sick. She wants to help." "I don't need help, Mom. I need to finish the project at work," I said, my voice barely reaching above the hum of the refrigerator. "You are stronger than she is," she replied, a phrase that had been my leash since I was 21. "It is your duty to keep us together." I didn't argue. I simply packed the leftovers, stood up, and left the room before the weight of her words could settle into my lungs. By the time Brielle showed up at my condo a week later, I was exhausted. She arrived with a ring light, a bouquet of grocery store lilies, and a smile that seemed to shimmer with its own light. She filmed me from the moment she entered the foyer, capturing every wince as I stood up to greet her. "I just want to document this journey for the followers," she said, her camera hovering near my shoulder. "People care so much about you, Elena." "Please, Brielle," I said, shielding my eyes from the glare. "I am not a project." She promised me then, with a hand over her heart, that nothing would be posted without my permission. She swore it on everything she claimed to value. I watched her leave, feeling a cold, hollow space open up in my chest. I should have paid closer attention to the way she deleted the file from her camera while walking to her car. I didn't. When the sun rose the next morning, the notifications started pinging on my phone. They came one after another, a relentless digital rain. Someone had posted a video of me looking tired, pale, and vulnerable, the caption declaring that my sister was dedicating her life to my salvation. By breakfast, the video had 500,000 views, and beneath it was a donation link I had never approved. The notification sounds haunted my sleep for the next 3 days. Every chime was a reminder that my privacy had been auctioned off in exchange for strangers' pity. I sat at my desk, scrolling through the comments under the video that had turned my life into a spectacle. Thousands of people I had never met were calling me brave, fragile, and a warrior, while praising Brielle for her tireless devotion. My fingers moved with clinical precision, capturing every version of the campaign page she kept editing. She had inflated my medical expenses, added imaginary costs for home care, and listed herself as a full-time caregiver. I saved each screenshot into a folder on my encrypted drive, documenting the timeline of the fraud. It was a cold, methodical process, one that kept the panic at bay by turning my own exploitation into data. When I finally called the family line, Patricia answered on the first ring, her voice already thick with tears. "Elena, please," she sobbed before I could even say hello. "Do you know how many people have reached out? They are praying for us. You are being so difficult about this." "The money, Mom," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. "The page claims thousands of dollars are going toward my treatment. I have not seen a single invoice paid by her." I have the right to know where the donations are going. She is just trying to give people a way to help, Patricia shouted, her tone shifting instantly from mourning to defensiveness. You have always been so jealous of the way she connects with people. Just let her do this. I am not signing anything, and I am not letting this continue without oversight, I replied. You are hurting your sister, and you are hurting me, she hissed, and the call went dead. Days turned into a blur of performance. Brielle arrived at my appointments, always with her phone in hand, waiting for the exact moment the doctor would emerge from the exam room so she could capture her supportive expression. Tessa was the one who actually drove me, who sat in the waiting room for hours while I underwent tests, yet she was never in the frame. One afternoon, Brielle posted a photo of a meal Tessa had cooked, captioning it as a home-cooked lunch she had prepared to boost my immunity. I watched her hit the publish button, the blue light of the screen reflecting in her eyes like a beacon. I began my spreadsheet. Column 1, the date. Column 2, the claim she made. Column 3, the reality. I became an auditor of my own suffering. My illness was no longer just a biological event. It was a resource to be managed, mined, and marketed. I started calling the hospital's billing department, keeping every statement in the binder I had hidden in the back of my closet. The turning point came when she posted a photo of a receipt. It showed a small payment to Street Gabriel Medical Center, and the caption bragged that the first major installment of my hospital debt had been cleared. The comments section exploded with adoration. I saved the image and waited until the house was quiet before pulling up the hospital's patient portal on my laptop. The hospital had received exactly $1,250. Brielle had told the internet she had paid $62,000. I sat in the dark for a long time, the glow of the screen illuminating the empty room. The betrayal felt like a physical weight, cold and heavy in my chest. She was not just using my name. She was using a fraction of the donations as a prop to keep the grift alive. My sister was a business owner, and my lungs were her inventory. I typed out an email to the billing department, my hands steady now, fueled by a clarity that felt terrifying. I requested a certified statement of every single transaction made on my account since the campaign began. I didn't call her. I didn't scream. I just kept my eyes on the data. I realized then that she was waiting for me to lose my temper, to act out so she could record a tearful video about how difficult it was to care for a sister who had lost her mind. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Instead, I emailed Brielle, keeping the language formal and distant. I asked for a full accounting of the campaign funds, citing the discrepancies I had already observed. I knew she wouldn't give it to me, but I needed the trail. I needed a paper record of every time she lied, every time she deflected, and every time she refused to acknowledge the reality of the money she was funneling into an account that had nothing to do with my recovery. The silence that followed my email lasted exactly 4 hours. Then, my phone buzzed against the wood of the desk. She wasn't calling. She was texting, and the message was short, sharp, and dripping with a venom I had spent my entire life trying to ignore. "You have no idea what you are doing to this family," she wrote. "Stop checking behind me. Just be a sister for once." I put the phone down, took a slow breath of thin, filtered air, and went back to the spreadsheet. I had $1,250 confirmed as the total payment. She had told the world $62,000. The gap between those two numbers was where my revenge would begin. Maya's office was not the kind of place where people came for comfort. It was a sterile, narrow room in a brick building downtown, filled with heavy, leather-bound folders, and the faint, permanent smell of coffee and ozone from a high-speed printer. She sat behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of mahogany, her glasses perched on the bridge of her nose as she reviewed the documents I had brought. I watched her for several minutes, waiting for a reaction. I had brought the binder, the blue one, and the spreadsheet. There were no emotional pleas, no tears, no dramatic flourishes. My illness had taken enough of my breath for me to waste it on performances. "You have been thorough, Elena," Maya said finally, setting a stack of bank statements aside. Her voice was level, clinical, devoid of the pity I had grown to expect from everyone else. Most people who come to me with family disputes have a diary full of feelings. "You have an audit. I want to know where the money went," I replied. "And I want to stop her from using my face to get it." There are several ways to proceed, Maya continued, leaning back in her chair. We can send a formal notice to preserve all records. We can contact the platform hosting the fundraiser and notify them that the primary beneficiary, that is you, has not authorized the current management. We can also look into the legal standing of this entity she keeps mentioning in her posts. What do you want to do? I asked. I want to know what your goal is, Maya said, her eyes tracking mine. Do you want to force her to apologize? Do you want to recover the stolen funds? Do you want to destroy the campaign entirely? I thought about the hours I had spent in that condo, the way my hands had shaken as I clicked through screenshots of my own life being sold off in small, digestible chunks. The betrayal felt less like a knife and more like a theft of my own identity. I want my life back before she sells the rest of it, I said. Whatever that requires, that is what we do. The next few days were a blur of bureaucratic machinery. Maya sent a preservation notice to Brielle, a legal document that turned the temperature in the family dynamic from simmering to boiling. It did not require Brielle to confess, but it legally prohibited her from deleting any digital correspondence, accounting records, or project files related to the fundraiser. Simultaneously, I sent a formal inquiry to the platform hosting the campaign, explaining that while my name was the face of the project, I held no control over the accounts or the disbursement of funds. The platform responded within 24 hours, acknowledging the dispute and opening a review process. They did not freeze the account immediately, that would require more evidence, but the gears were turning. I expected Brielle to react with a tantrum, but instead, she sat on my sofa, holding a box of expensive pastries, and looked at me with eyes that seemed to have been trained in a mirror. I don't know why you're getting lawyers involved, she said, her voice dripping with soft, sugary concern. You're so sick, Elena. You're confused. This is just paperwork to make sure the foundation is secure for when you're better. She reached into her purse and pulled out a stack of documents. They were thick, professional-looking, and smelled faintly of expensive ink. This is just an authorization. It lets me pay the vendors who have been working on the podcast and the documentary. If you just sign this, all of this stress will go away. I leaned forward, my breath hitching as I read the fine print. It was a sprawling, all-encompassing release. It granted her complete authority to manage my medical narrative, utilize my image in perpetuity, and redirect any remaining funds toward what she vaguely termed advocacy. I'll have my lawyer review this, I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. Brielle stiffened, the sugar in her voice curdling. Your lawyer? That woman you hired to strip me of my ability to help you? You're going to let a stranger dictate how you recover? I am going to let a professional ensure that I don't sign away my life, I replied. She stood up so quickly that the pastries slid off the coffee table, a grotesque mess on the rug. Her face turned a shade of mottled, ugly red. You are being an ingrate. After everything I have sacrificed, everything I have built for you, you treat me like a criminal? If you have nothing to hide, the lawyer won't find anything, I said. She stared at me, her chest heaving, then grabbed her purse and stormed out, leaving the door swinging on its hinges. I stood there for a long time, listening to the heavy thump of her boots against the stairs, feeling a strange, hollow victory. I had said no. It was the simplest word in the language, yet it felt like I had just cut an anchor that had been dragging me down for years. Once the adrenaline faded, I returned to my laptop. I had been digging into the corporate registry, using the name of the entity Brielle kept mentioning, Mercer Care Media Limited Liability Company. It was a name that sounded legitimate, professional, and entirely hollow. I searched the address associated with the filing. It wasn't an office building. It wasn't a studio. It was a commercial mailbox in a strip mall I hadn't visited since college. I traced the ownership back. It was registered to a single person, Brielle Mercer. I stared at the screen, the data coalescing into a single, devastating reality. The fundraiser wasn't an initiative to support a sister. It was a shell company designed to move money under the guise of medical necessity. My illness was the product, and she was the sole proprietor. I kept digging. I remembered the name Avery Lane, the woman Brielle had introduced as her lead brand consultant during that brunch at Patricia's house. I tracked down her LinkedIn and found a professional website. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was a long shot, but I needed to know if the expenses Brielle had mentioned to me were real. I took a bus to the neighborhood where Avery's studio was located. It was a bright, airy space filled with racks of equipment and shelves of books on branding and digital strategy. Avery was there, packing up a workstation, and she looked startled when I walked in. "Elena?" she asked, adjusting her glasses. "Are you okay? You look pale." "I am fine," I said, bracing myself against a chair. "I am here about Mercer Care Media." Brielle showed me an invoice for $24,000 for brand consulting. Avery went perfectly still. She looked at the door, then back at me, her expression unreadable. "I think you should leave, Elena. I have an NDA with Brielle." "If that invoice is fraudulent, your NDA doesn't protect her," I said, reaching into my bag for the printout of the authorization form. "I just need to know one thing. Did you ever receive $24,000 for this project?" Avery stepped closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I'm a professional, Elena. My rates are public. I performed $4,000 worth of work. I told her I would not continue the contract after you pulled your consent. She told me she would handle the release." The ground seemed to tilt beneath me. "She forged the invoice?" "She's been very insistent about the budget," Avery said, her gaze fixed on the floor. "And she was very insistent that I stay out of the communication between you and her. I should have known, but I was focused on the project." "Did you ever sign a release for her?" "No," I said, the word coming out as a jagged breath. I left the studio and walked for blocks, the city air swirling around me. Every piece of the puzzle was falling into place. She hadn't just exaggerated costs. She had created a fraudulent infrastructure around my very survival. When I reached Maya's office the next morning, I was exhausted, but I was focused. I presented the findings, the fake company, the mailbox address, the discrepancy between Avery's actual work and the invoice Brielle had presented. "She is building a paper trail, but she is doing it in a way that creates exposure," Maya said, her eyes scanning the documents. She turned her monitor around, pointing to a document Brielle had sent as part of her accounting. It was a mess of vague line items, but at the bottom, there was a series of wire transfer confirmation numbers. One of the documents had been clipped into a larger PDF, and by zooming in on the footer, we could see the last 4 digits of the receiving account. I froze. They were the same 4 digits that appeared on the bank statement for Mercer Care Media. "She didn't even try to hide the destination," Maya said, her voice devoid of judgment, just the cold, hard reality of the law. "She sent the payout directly to her own account." I leaned back, the hum of the office fluorescent lights suddenly sounding very loud. I had wanted my life back, but looking at those 4 digits, I realized that Brielle hadn't just stolen money. She had been operating a criminal enterprise with my name on the marquee. "Can we freeze it?" I asked. "Not yet," Maya said, her expression guarded. "We need more than a suspicion of a conflict. We need proof of fraudulent intent. If she can argue that she used these funds for overhead, media expenses, and administrative costs, she might be able to drag this out for years. But you've given me the thread, Elena. Now we just have to pull it until the whole thing unravels." I left the office and walked into the bright, indifferent sunshine. I had spent 20 years being the strong one, the one who held everything together, the one who stepped into every breach. I had carried Patricia, I had carried Brielle, and I had carried my own life until there was almost nothing left of it. I looked at my reflection in a shop window. I looked tired, older than 39, and fragile, but the look in my eyes was different. It wasn't the look of a victim, and it wasn't the look of a martyr. It was the look of a woman who had finally realized that the house she had spent her life building was burning down, and for the first time, she wasn't going to grab a bucket. She was just going to let it burn and walk away. I took out my phone and checked the fundraiser page one last time. She had posted a new update. It was a video of her sitting in a quiet, sunlit room, her eyes wet with tears. "My sister is going through so much," she said to the camera, her voice trembling with the perfect amount of grief. "The medical bills are mounting, and the stress is just unimaginable. I don't know how I do it, honestly. But I have to be the strong one. I have to be the one who believes she can get better, even when she gives up on herself." I watched the video, then saved it to the encrypted folder. It was the perfect piece of evidence. It was an admission that she knew the bills were mounting, which confirmed she knew the funds were meant for my care. And it was a direct hit to the caregiver narrative she was peddling. I walked home, the weight of the binder in my bag feeling like a shield. I wasn't just a sister anymore. I was an auditor, and as I reached the door of my condo, I knew exactly what the next move would be. She thought she was the one holding the camera, but she had no idea that I had been watching the frame the entire time. The payout destination was not my account. It belonged to Mercer Care Media Limited Liability Company. And the only owner was Brielle. 10 days before the night I nearly lost my breath in the hospital, the office was quiet. I sat at my desk, the hum of the air conditioner, the only sound in the room, when an email from a major corporate sponsor flashed across my screen. They were performing an audit of the initiative Brielle had been aggressively pitching, and they wanted to verify the authorization I had reportedly signed. I opened the attachment. It was a formal authorization document, dated back to the month I had been undergoing my first set of diagnostic procedures. My eyes traced the signature at the bottom. It was mine, perfectly looped, the exact slant of my pen, the precise pressure I applied when signing my name. But the date made no sense. I had been at the radiology clinic, not at home, and I certainly hadn't seen this document. My stomach dropped, that familiar, cold sensation of betrayal settling in. I pulled up my email archive and searched for any correspondence from that period. There it was, an email I had sent to Brielle on the very day mentioned in the document, explicitly stating that I did not authorize the use of my medical history for a public initiative. I took the packet to Maya. She studied the file on her monitor, zooming in until the pixels were visible. "Look at the edge of the signature," she said, her voice dropping into a professional, detached tone. "Do you see the faint, unnatural border? It looks like an image of your signature was cut from another document and pasted here. We would need a forensic expert to prove it. But this is not a wet signature. It's a digital insertion." The implications were staggering. Someone had not only forged my signature, but had done so with access to my personal paperwork. I left Maya's office with a buzzing in my ears that blocked out the city traffic. I didn't head home. I drove toward the house on Oak Street, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. Patricia was in the kitchen, the smell of burnt toast clinging to her apron. She didn't look up when I walked in, just kept scrubbing at a spot on the counter that wasn't there. "Mom," I said, my voice sounding hollow in the small, stifling space. "I need to know something. Did you send Brielle any of my old tax documents or files?" She froze. The scrubbing stopped. She turned, her face a mask of practiced hurt. "I have no idea what you are talking about, Elena. I just try to keep things organized. I still have those old scans of your signature in the cabinet, just in case you ever needed them for a loan or a permit. Why are you always making life so difficult?" The memory clicked into place with sickening clarity. 6 months ago, when I had been clearing out the house to move to the condo, Patricia had insisted that I leave the old tax folders, promising they were safe in the cabinet for family use. I hadn't realized then that she was treating my life like a library, handing out pieces of my identity to Brielle whenever she needed a shortcut. "You gave them to her," I said, a statement, not a question. "I only gave her one old scan of your signature," she whispered, her eyes shifting away from mine. "She told me it was just to finish some paperwork that you had already agreed to in principle. She promised me she was just trying to save the family from debt." "You always say no when you have time to think, Elena." I thought I was helping. I didn't scream. I didn't demand an explanation. I just walked past her into the living room, to the cabinet she kept locked, and found it empty. I had spent my entire life trying to be the daughter she wanted, the one who kept the peace, and she had spent her entire life using me as a resource for the sister who played the victim. I left the house without another word. I went back to the condo and packed the few items I had left behind: my passport, my birth certificate, and the few photographs of my father that hadn't been ruined by the humidity of that house. "I am removing the things you keep handing to Brielle," I told her through the phone when she called an hour later, demanding to know what I was doing. That night, Brielle hosted one of her live streams. I sat in the dark of my living room, the only light coming from the screen as she spun a tale about outside forces manipulating me during my recovery. She described my lawyer as a vulture, and I watched, paralyzed, as Patricia sat in the background, nodding at every word. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. A public theater where I was the villain for demanding the truth. I didn't comment. I didn't post a rebuttal. I simply recorded it all. I spent the next few days in a fog. My body was betraying me as much as my family was. I felt the familiar weight tow the lungs, the desperate need for oxygen that felt like breathing through a straw. I still had the binder, the blue one, sitting on my kitchen table like a holy relic of the life I had been forced to protect. I found a notification on my phone from the hospital portal, a request for a follow-up appointment. I looked at the date and realized I had a window of time before the next crisis hit. I had to get to the bank, to the registrar, to every place that held a piece of my paper identity. I had to cut the ties before she could weave any more knots. The air in Raleigh seemed to thicken, the humidity of the coming spring pressing down on the city. Every time the phone rang, I jumped. Every time a car pulled into the parking lot of the condo, I rushed to the window, terrified that she had found a way to bridge the distance. She sent a text late that evening. "Mom is worried about you. Just sign the document, and we can all go back to normal. Don't throw away everything we have because you're having a bad month." I stared at the screen, my pulse thudding in my throat. They didn't see me. They saw a resource that was currently malfunctioning. They didn't see a woman fighting for her life. They saw a piece of equipment that needed to be recalibrated to keep the money flowing. I went to the binder, my fingers trailing over the tabs. I had documents for the condo, documents for the proxy, documents that defined my existence independent of the family name. I took a photo of the email where I had explicitly refused to sign the authorization, and I sent it to Maya. "This is the proof," I whispered to the empty room. "This is the proof that I never agreed." I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the balcony, watching the streetlights flicker below. I felt a strange, detached peace. The betrayal was complete. There were no more illusions left to shatter. No more secrets hiding under the floorboards. Everything was exposed, raw and bleeding. The next morning, the hospital called to confirm my admission. I had been planning to wait until the weekend, but the tightness in my chest made the decision for me. I packed a small bag, tucked the binder into the very bottom, and walked out the door. When I checked into Street Gabriel's, I was going there because my lungs needed treatment. But I was no longer entering that hospital as a woman whose family controlled her name, her visitors, or her evidence. As I drove toward the hospital, I passed the house on Oak Street one last time. It looked small, pathetic, and lonely in the morning mist. I didn't look back. The woman who had lived there, the one who had sacrificed everything for a family that didn't know how to love her, was gone. She had been replaced by someone who knew exactly what the price of her life was, and who was finally ready to make sure someone else paid it. I reached the hospital entrance, the familiar smell of antiseptic greeting me like a familiar, unpleasant friend. I checked in at the desk, my movements slow and deliberate. I knew Brielle would be there soon. She thrived on the drama of a hospital corridor, the soft lighting, the potential for a photo opportunity. But this time, I had the binder. I had the truth. And for the first time in 39 years, I wasn't waiting for anyone to save me. I was waiting for the truth to catch up with the people who had built their lives on my silence. Avery Lane contacted me 2 days after I admitted myself to the hospital, her voice taut with a professional distance that suggested she had finally realized the depth of the deception. She arrived at the medical center during visiting hours, carrying a folder that smelled of high-end toner and panic. We sat in the small, sterile lounge, the hum of the vending machine filling the silence between us as she slid the documents across the table. "I am not going down for this, Elena," Avery said, her hands trembling as she smoothed the edge of an invoice. "I have my own business to protect. I performed $4,000 worth of brand consulting for that campaign, and I stopped everything the moment you rescinded your consent. This document Brielle submitted to the sponsors, the one for $24,000, that is not my work. That is not my signature style." I examined the page. The font was slightly off, and the letterhead was a low-resolution scan of my studio's original design. But the signature was an amateurish attempt to mimic Avery's flourish. It was a digital forgery, a clumsy cut-and-paste job that looked like it had been slapped together in a hurry. Did she ever explain why she needed a bill for this amount? I asked, my voice steady. She kept saying the sponsors required a larger operational budget to keep the momentum going, Avery replied, clutching her bag tightly. I told her I wouldn't provide it, so she clearly just took an old invoice and altered it herself. She even kept my email address on the letterhead to make it look legitimate, knowing I would be the one blamed if anyone asked questions. She thought I was just another pawn in her little production. I looked at the receipts Brielle had posted to her social media earlier that month. They were small, insignificant payments compared to the thousands pouring into the campaign. But they served as props for her narrative of financial burden. I took the original invoice Avery had provided and compared it to the numbers in my spreadsheet. The math was simple, cold, and damning. The money was being funneled into Mercer Care Media Limited Liability Company, a legal entity that existed solely to act as a funnel for the donations, effectively shielding the funds from any oversight that might have been applied to a direct medical account. I need your official statement on this, Avery, I said, and the email where you refused the contract. I have them ready, she said, nodding. I don't want any part of what is coming for her. Once Avery left, I sat in the lounge, the reality of my sister's greed settling into my bones. This wasn't just a betrayal of family, it was a carefully constructed mechanism of theft. I spent the next several hours in my hospital room, matching the dates of the fake invoices with the dates of Brielle's social media posts. The correlation was exact. Every time she posted a new request for donations, she would generate a new, fraudulent expense to ensure that any funds that might have actually reached my medical bills were intercepted by her company. My lungs burned with every breath, and the persistent, low-grade fever made it hard to focus, but the data was my tether. I was no longer just the patient in the room. I was the architect of my own defense. Tessa visited that evening, bringing a change of clothes and the latest news from the condo. The platform sent another message, she said, sitting on the edge of the bed. They are reviewing the account. They have locked the ability to withdraw any more funds until they receive an explanation for the discrepancies we flagged. That will push her into a corner, I said. She will try to fabricate something else. Let her, Tessa replied, handing me a glass of water. She is running out of walls to back into. I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep, my mind racing with the logistics of the coming confrontation. When I woke up, the air in the room felt heavy, and the nurses were moving with an urgent, hurried rhythm that made my heart spike. My breath was shallow, the oxygen levels dipping low enough that the machine began its rhythmic, persistent alarm. I was being moved to a more closely monitored room, the medical team working around me with efficient, practiced hands. I realized then that my body was giving up, pushed to the brink by the stress of the last year and the physical toll of the illness. Brielle arrived a few hours later, bringing a ring light and a professional assistant who looked ready to document a tragedy. I watched through the heavy haze of my own exhaustion as they tried to set up their equipment in the corridor outside my room. You cannot film here, Tessa said, her voice sharp as she blocked their path. She stood firm, a wall of protective loyalty, brandishing the healthcare proxy I had signed months ago. Elena has revoked all consent for recording. If you step 1 foot inside that room, I will call security. Patricia tried to push past, tears streaming down her face, but she stopped when she saw the security guard standing near the nurse's station. Brielle stood there, her face a mask of wounded confusion, the ring light casting an eerie glow on her pristine makeup. For the first time, she saw that I had built a life that she could not control, a network of people who held the keys she had long ago lost the right to use. I lay in the bed, watching them through the partially open door. The exhaustion was absolute, a weight that threatened to pull me under. But the sight of Brielle standing there, blocked by the very boundaries I had set, gave me a strength I hadn't felt in weeks. That night, my phone buzzed with a series of frantic messages from Brielle. She had shifted tactics, moving from the sweet sister act to a desperate, aggressive defense. You are ruining everything, she wrote. If this account is closed, they will come after all of us. You have to tell them the billing was just a mistake. Tell them you misunderstood the process. We need to settle this before you ruin everything. I looked at the timestamp, 8:47 in the evening. I took a screenshot, saved it to the folder, and placed the phone on the tray. The final text arrived right on cue, a desperate plea from someone who was finally realizing that the ground beneath her had turned to glass. I wasn't just ruined, I was ready, I didn't wait for her to come inside. After that final text arrived, I took a long, steady breath and navigated to the recording app on my phone. I checked the settings one last time, ensuring the cloud synchronization was disabled and the file name was saved correctly. I had learned that lesson months ago, when Brielle's casual denial of our conversations had become her primary defense. I wasn't leaving anything to chance. When Patricia finally convinced the nurses to grant Brielle 5 minutes for a reconciliation visit, I agreed. I needed her to speak while the recorder was running. I requested that the door remain open, a small concession that served as my only buffer. Brielle entered with a heavy, performative sigh. She moved the authorization form onto the rolling bedside table, her motions fluid and practiced. "Elena, please," she whispered, leaning close enough that I could smell the synthetic floral scent of her perfume. "The sponsors are threatening to pull everything. Just sign this so I can pay the bills and keep our family's reputation intact." "What bills, Brielle?" I asked, my voice thin but audible enough for the device. "The hospital claims nothing is being paid. Where is the money from Mercer Care Media?" She stepped back, her face hardening. "That is for management fees. You are so caught up in the details that you're missing the big picture. We are building a movement. This family has a brand, and you are trying to burn it down because you're scared of being visible." "I am not a business model," I replied, the effort of speaking making my chest ache. "Maya sent a preservation notice to your firm." "Did you receive it?" Her face went pale, then red. "You are just an embittered, sick woman trying to drag me into your misery. I have done nothing but save you." I had hoped she would admit where the money had gone. I never imagined what she would do next. Brielle reached for the oxygen tubing before I understood what she intended. She tore it from my face, stepped between me and the call button, and raised her phone as my breathing collapsed. The alarm rose as my oxygen level fell. I stopped trying to argue and focused everything I had on reaching the button behind her. Brielle kept filming. Dana appeared in the doorway seconds later. She pushed past Brielle, restored the oxygen, and called for the emergency team. This time, the scene was no longer a blur. I understood exactly why Brielle had positioned her phone before touching me. I drifted in and out of consciousness as the staff stabilized me, the sharp smell of antiseptic and the sound of machines becoming my entire world. It wasn't until the next morning, when Detective Price stood beside my bed, that I understood the full scope of what had happened. He didn't look at Brielle, who was standing in the corner of the room, her composure finally beginning to shatter as she saw the hospital security staff waiting in the hall. The detective looked only at me. He explained that Brielle had submitted a video to the hospital administration, claiming I had attacked her and that she had acted in self-defense. However, the metadata in the file she provided had been tampered with, and the timestamp didn't align with the room's sensor logs. Detective Price did not play the original recording that morning. He explained that hospital security had noticed the clip was a newly exported file and that its duration did not match the recording data on Brielle's phone. The device had been preserved for forensic review. If an unedited copy still existed on the phone or its connected backup account, investigators would need lawful access before they could recover it. For the moment, they had the edited clip, my audio recording, Dana's statement, and the monitor timeline. It was enough to prove that Brielle's version of the night could not be accepted at face value. I signed a formal directive the following day, explicitly prohibiting the nursing staff from allowing Brielle or Patricia entry into my room without my express, individual consent. Tessa managed my phone, routing all calls from the family directly to voicemail. Listening to those messages felt like hearing the echoes of a life I had already discarded. Patricia's voice, trembling and hollow, referred to the attack as one terrible minute, a phrase she repeated until it lost all meaning. Brielle took to social media, posting a carefully curated statement suggesting that the medications I was receiving had left me confused and aggressive. She used the clip she had initially provided to security, the one that conveniently started after she had already ripped the tube away, to paint herself as a victim of my supposed mental decline. I wanted to publish the audio recording, to shatter her narrative with the sound of her own voice, but Maya stopped me. The investigation was still in its early stages, and the evidence had to remain pristine. By the end of the week, the fundraising platform had frozen the account associated with Mercer Care Media. They hadn't reached a final verdict on Brielle's guilt, but the sheer volume of complaints and the discrepancy in billing had forced their hand. The corporate sponsors followed suit, halting the launch of the initiative and requesting a full audit of every dollar Brielle had claimed to have spent on my care. She lost her primary source of income overnight, and the panic in the voicemails Tessa played for me became increasingly frantic. Patricia finally asked Maya to arrange a brief, attorney-supervised meeting at the hospital. She begged me to tell the police that Brielle had simply panicked during a stressful moment. "Have you actually watched the full video, Mom?" I asked, my voice cold. "I don't need to see it to know that she loves you," Patricia replied, her eyes darting away. "Love doesn't require deleting 43 seconds of footage," I said. 2 weeks later, Maya received a complete sponsor packet. Buried within the fine print was a contract, featuring an e-signature that looked strikingly like mine, but the metadata proved it had been generated on Brielle's own laptop. The document guaranteed Brielle an advance of $75,000, with an appendix detailing that her content would continue even if I became unavailable or withdrew my participation. The truth hit me with a clarity that left me breathless. She had never been trying to save me. She had been trying to secure a future where I was permanently ill, a source of revenue she could own long after I was gone. I looked at the final contract sitting on the conference table, the ink still seeming to glow under the fluorescent lights. It paid Brielle $75,000 for the right to keep telling my story after I stopped cooperating. I was no longer a person to her. I was a legacy she was planning to harvest. I picked up my bag, binder tucked safely inside, and prepared for the meeting. The mask was already in pieces. It was time to show everyone what she had been hiding all along. The conference room smelled of cold coffee and stale ambition. I walked through the door under my own power, my portable oxygen tank clicking softly against my side like a metronome marking time. Brielle sat at the head of the table, dressed in a muted, expensive sweater that screamed performative humility. She lunged forward the moment she saw me, her arms outstretched for a hug, but I simply sidestepped her and sat beside Maya. Brielle began her speech, her voice a practiced melody of victimhood. She spoke of her devotion, her sacrifices, and the heavy emotional weight of watching a sister wither away. She gestured toward the screen, displaying the edited video clip, the one that painted me as an unstable burden. Patricia sat nearby, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, nodding along as if listening to a sermon. Maya didn't interrupt. She let Brielle weave the entire tapestry of lies. Only when my sister finished, her final, tearful plea for understanding hanging in the air, did Maya open the binder. She presented the hospital statement alongside the social media posts Brielle had made, pointing out the timestamp for that paltry $1,250 payment. When Brielle dismissed the evidence as a mere administrative error, Maya shifted to the ownership records of Mercer Care Media. Avery Lane spoke next, holding the real invoice and the original emails. Her voice remained steady as she explained that Brielle had altered a $4,000 invoice into a fraudulent $24,000 expense. The room grew suffocatingly silent. Maya then presented the forged authorization and the digital trail of the email where I had explicitly said no. Brielle turned to Patricia, her eyes wild, begging her to lie one last time, to claim I had agreed to the initiative during a private conversation. Patricia looked down at the documents, her face pale. The weight of the impending perjury silenced her. She chose not to speak. Brielle tried to pivot one last time, insisting the edited clip proved her need for self-defense, but Maya played the original video that a forensic examiner had recovered after investigators obtained lawful access to Brielle's device and connected backup account. Everyone watched the screen as Brielle set the phone up, blocked the call button, and tore the oxygen tube from my face. "I built all of this," Brielle screamed, her composure finally shattering into jagged, ugly shards. Elena would still be invisible without me. "You didn't give me a voice," I said, my voice cutting through her rage like glass. "You charged people to speak over it." The sponsor representatives stood, their faces grim, and immediately terminated the contract. The platform representative confirmed they were turning over all records to the authorities. As I stood to leave, Patricia caught my arm in the hallway, her grip desperate. "Please tell the judge Brielle didn't mean it," she whispered, the last vestige of her dignity dissolving in the sterile light of the corridor. Patricia showed up at my condo 3 days after the meeting, her face drawn and tired. She didn't have a key anymore, so she stood on the welcome mat, knocking with a rhythm that felt like an intrusion from a previous life. When I opened the door, she looked past me into the apartment, searching for a place that didn't exist for her. She begged me to call the prosecutor and claim the hospital incident was just an impulsive mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment from a worried sister. I kept the door half closed, my hand steady on the frame. I didn't yell, but I didn't soften my stance either. I handed her a cardboard box filled with old photographs and ornaments, remnants of a home I no longer recognized, and told her that I would speak to her once a month, but that I would never again pay for her silence or Brielle's chaos. Watching her walk away down the hallway, I realized that for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't responsible for the path she chose to walk. The months that followed were a grueling assembly of evidence. Prosecutors worked through bank records, sponsor contracts, and the digital footprints left on the devices. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow, systematic dismantling of a fraud. I spent hours in meetings with legal teams, ensuring every dollar trail and digital signature was accounted for. Brielle eventually entered a plea deal, accepting responsibility for her actions at the hospital, the forgery of the contracts, and the misappropriation of donor funds. Standing in the courtroom, hearing the judge read out the charges, I felt a strange, detached calm. She received 4 years of actual incarceration, followed by a long period of supervised release and a substantial restitution order. The court was explicit in its final decree. She was strictly prohibited from managing any charitable campaign or nonprofit fund for the foreseeable future. She looked at me once before the bailiff took her away, but there was no apology in her eyes, only the same resentment I had navigated since I was 21. Patricia took the fall in her own way. She pulled her support from the Mercer Care Initiative and signed a public retraction, using her own savings to contribute to the civil restitution for her role in the false statements and forged documents. The community that had once worshipped her as the model of maternal sacrifice looked at her now with cold indifference. She was no longer the matriarch of a perfect family. She was just a woman who had helped lie to her own child. I heard through the grapevine that she spent her afternoons alone, the house on Oak Street now too quiet for the stories she used to tell. I didn't offer comfort. I only agreed to a short phone call once a month, keeping the boundaries as rigid as steel. I would not cover her debts, and I would not manage her crises. My health stabilized, though the doctors made it clear that I would always have to be careful. I kept my consulting business modest, choosing my clients with a cynicism that had become my armor. I didn't need the massive, sprawling projects anymore. I just needed the work that kept my mind sharp and my independence secure. Tessa and I still met for dinner, but we never spoke of the cameras, the ring lights, or the staged grief. We just talked about work, books, and the quiet joy of a Tuesday evening that required no performance. It was a simple, unremarkable life, and for the first time, that was enough. Last week, a letter arrived from Brielle at the prison. She didn't offer a single apology. Instead, she wrote that I had allowed everyone to take everything away from her after all she had done for me. The sheer audacity of the claim was almost impressive. She still viewed her victims as her assets, and her imprisonment as a personal betrayal by the people she had tried to destroy. I didn't reach out to correct her. I didn't try to explain that she had taken it from herself the moment she picked up that camera to turn my suffering into content. I simply placed the letter into the file folder I kept for the case and closed the drawer. It was just another piece of data, filed away and done with. It is July now, and the evening light on my balcony is golden and still. I turned off my phone, letting the silence of the apartment settle around me. There were no donation notifications, no desperate texts from my mother, and no cameras waiting to catch me in a moment of weakness. I looked out over the city, breathing in air that felt clean and entirely mine. The revenge I had sought wasn't about the prison sentence or the money she lost. It was about the refusal to remain a prop in someone else's manufactured tragedy. Brielle had spent years turning my illness into her story. The last thing I took back was the ending. You might think that your loyalty is the mortar that holds your family together, but sometimes you are only holding up a wall that is meant to collapse on you. My story taught me that being the strong one is often just a polite way of saying you are the one being used. If you find yourself constantly absorbing the consequences of someone else's recklessness, stop for a moment and ask yourself if you are truly being a support system, or if you are simply an insurance policy for their bad behavior. You have to recognize that setting a boundary is not an act of selfishness. It is a necessary act of survival when you realize that the people who claim to love you are actually the ones harvesting your life for their own gain. Do not wait for them to have an epiphany or to finally acknowledge the damage they have caused, because people who treat you as an asset do not suddenly develop the capacity to see you as a person just because you are suffering. You must learn to document the truth, to protect your own name, and to understand that you are not obligated to save someone who is actively trying to sink you to keep themselves afloat. True family does not require you to sacrifice your sanity, your health, or your integrity just to keep a public mask from slipping. If you are standing in a house that is burning, you have the right to walk out the door, and you have the right to refuse to hand them the matches for the next fire. Take a look at the people you are currently carrying and ask yourself, if you stopped holding them up today, would they finally learn to stand on their own? Or would they simply find someone else to tear down? Have you ever felt that your capacity for forgiveness was being weaponized against you? And what is one boundary you know you need to draw today before your own story is taken out of your hands?